Little Red Riding Hood is a story that has been passed down for centuries now. It has gone through many changes and interpretations, and it still plays a large role in society today. This is not only because it's a creative fairy tale, but it's also because it teaches valuable lessons through the countless interpretations of the story that have been presented over time, with lessons such as why you shouldn't talk to strangers or why you should obey your parents being the most obvious interpretations. However, with a story so broadly open to interpretation, partially due to its simplicity, it allows itself to be open to a number of interpretations through theories. The concepts that I will be using in this video come from the theories of psychoanalysis along with the Brothers Grimm version of the fairy tale. Now, since I will be using psychoanalysis to analyze Little Red Riding Hood, naturally many of the ideas presented in this video will come from Sigmund Freud, the Austrian neurologist who founded psychoanalysis. However, I will also be using the interpretations of Terry Eagleton, who in his book titled Litteray Theory, an introduction, summarizes the idea of Sigmund Freud pretty well in his 5th chapter fittingly titled Psychoanalysis. I will also be using some ideas from Laura Mulvey, a film theorist who utilizes psychoanalysis in her works such as The Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. And as I briefly stated earlier, I will be using the Brothers Grimm version of the Little Red Riding Hood fairy tale. So as a short refresher to the story, there's a little girl who is called Little Red Riding Hood because she is always seen wearing a red hood. One day, her grandmother becomes sick, so Little Red Riding Hood's mom asks if she can take some cake and wine to her grandmother's house, but warns her to stay on the designated trail. Along her way to the grandmother's house, Little Red Riding Hood meets a wolf who asks her what she's doing. Little Red Riding Hood tells the wolf about the task her mom gave her, and tells the wolf where her grandmother's house is. The wolf then gives Little Red Riding Hood the idea to go pick some flowers instead of going directly to her grandmother's house. So while Little Red Riding Hood goes to pick flowers, the wolf then goes to the grandmother's house, eats her, and puts on her clothes. Little Red Riding Hood then shows up at the grandmother's house, where the wolf is pretending to be her grandmother, and tricks Little Red Riding Hood long enough for the wolf to eat her too. Eventually, a huntsman comes to the house and sees the wolf, and he decides that he wants to kill it, but before he does this, he considers the possibility that there may be something living inside of the wolf's stomach. So he cuts open the wolf and frees Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother. Little Red Riding Hood then collects some stones, which they then place inside of the wolf, which causes the wolf to fall down and die as soon as he wakes up. The huntsman then takes the wolf's skin and leaves. Now sometime later, Little Red Riding Hood is heading to her grandmother's house again, when another wolf tries to stop her. Little Red Riding Hood, being wiser now, heads directly to her grandmother's house. The wolf, however, still tries to get into the house to eat them. So Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother tells Little Red Riding Hood to collect some old sausage water and fill up a trough with it. When the wolf smells the water from the trough, he dives inside and drowns in the water that Little Red Riding Hood collected. So now that we have the story clearly laid out, I'm going to show how the different ideas found in psychoanalysis work within the characters of the story in order to move the story forward. So the best place to start with is the ego. The egos of the many characters in Little Red Riding Hood, or what makes them have a sense of who they are, is rooted in their clothing. As shown in psychoanalysis, objects, or in this case clothing, are often tied to the sense of self. This is why Little Red Riding Hood is not even given a name in this story, because it is not the names that have been deemed important, but what each character themselves finds as important is what creates who they are. For Little Red Riding Hood, it's her red cap, or hood. This is just one of a number of reasons why Little Red Riding Hood is tricked by the wolf when the wolf wears the grandmother's clothing, and why the huntsman takes the wolf's skin after it is killed. Now one can argue that the wolf does not have any clothes. However, the fact that the huntsman takes the wolf's skin, coupled with the second wolf being described as the Greybeard, shows that the wolf's hide is the wolf's clothing. Now that we have established clear individual egos of the characters, we can identify each character's id as well. The id of each character is found in their desires. The grandmother probably has the weakest id in the story, or she suppresses it pretty well, while the wolf almost completely acts entirely out of his id. The id is what causes Little Red Riding Hood to go off the main path that leads to her grandmother's house and pick flowers instead. Little Red Riding Hood is shown to have a relatively strong id, as she is shown to always be desiring a new flower which is better than the last. The huntsman is shown to have a desire for the wolf's skin, however he is able to suppress his id more than both Red Riding Hood and the wolf, who both act very much on impulse. He shows this by not killing the wolf immediately for his skin, but first checking to see if there are any survivors inside of the wolf. The presence of the grandmother's id is almost non-existent, with the only instance being her desire for the gifts that Little Red Riding Hood was told to bring for her anyway. Now that we know some of the desires of the characters which expresses the presence of the id within each of them, we can now look at the id's opposition, which is the superego. The superego is like the conscience, and the two characters who are shown to have some of the strongest superegos found in this story is the grandmother and the huntsman, while Little Red Riding Hood's superego develops throughout the story, and the wolf is shown to have one of the weakest ones. As stated before, the superego is like the conscience. We can even look at the id and the superego as those stereotypical angels and devils you see on people's shoulders in cartoons, with one suggesting the character do what is morally right, while the other tells them what they want or desire, and to follow that. Little Red Riding Hood's superego develops after her id causes her to pick up flowers. Her superego is what causes her to get back on track and go to her grandmother's house. The huntsman's superego is what allows him to suppress his id long enough to save Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother instead of shooting the wolf, and the grandmother's superego is what keeps her from letting the second wolf enter the house. However, the wolf uses his superego in a very different way. Where most characters use their superegos to suppress their id, the wolf uses his superego just long enough to strategize how he plans to obtain his desires. The wolf's selfish use of his superego works alongside his voyeuristic scopophilia. When the wolf looks at people, he doesn't see people, he sees something that he desires, and through this form of scopophilia, he treats people as objects. However, it is through a small presence of his superego that he is able to hold off on eating Little Red Riding Hood just long enough to form a more elaborate plan that ends with him not only getting what he desires, which is Little Red Riding Hood, but also getting something that he only slightly desires, which is the grandmother. So in this way, the wolf uses his superego for the benefit of his id. So with these established ids and superegos of the characters, we're able to see how these lead to other concepts of psychoanalysis and how they affect some of the characters in the story. The wolf's plan of tricking Little Red Riding Hood, although pretty creative, isn't a realistically well thought out plan, but it works. The reason why it works is due to Little Red Riding Hood experiencing psychosis. Psychosis is somewhat of a reality bender for whoever is experiencing it. It's not the same thing as experiencing hallucinations, but it could be easily mistaken for it. This psychosis is what causes Little Red Riding Hood to be delusional enough to be somewhat convinced by the wolf's disguise. In the moment that Little Red Riding Hood questions the wolf about his physical features, which obviously differ from her grandmother's, psychosis is causing her to latch on to the idea that this might be her grandmother, due to her attachment to the idea of who her grandmother is, due to her clearly laid out system of attaching clothing to identity. So in this way, we can still see Little Red Riding Hood's desire being powerful enough to negatively affect her. Another character who shows a clear attachment to objects or clothing is the huntsman. The huntsman is shown to have a sort of desire to be the wolf or obtain the wolf's ego. This concept in the huntsman's dilemma is closely related to narcissistic scopophilia. This is also the reason why the huntsman is able to relate enough to the wolf to consider that there may still be prey inside of the sleeping wolf when he decides to cut it open instead of shooting it. This is also why the huntsman takes the wolf's skin after the wolf is killed. It's because he is still under the effects of narcissistic scopophilia and feels that physically wearing the wolf will give him a more complete or ideal ego or identity. So in this way, the huntsman is shown to also have delusions about identity as they relate to clothing in the same way that Little Red Riding Hood did when she saw the wolf wearing her grandmother's clothing to alter the perception of the identity that was being presented. Although the id and desire is shown to be a powerful force in the story, Little Red Riding Hood shows the reader how the id can be suppressed through sublimation. One character who sublimates their desire twice throughout the story is Little Red Riding Hood herself. The first time she does this results in the killing of the first wolf of the story. When someone sublimates their desires, they make use of the id. Little Red Riding Hood is shown to do this after being cut out of the first wolf. As shown earlier in the story, Little Red Riding Hood has a desire to go out and collect flowers. However, later she is able to sublimate the desire for collecting flowers into the action of collecting the stones which kills the first wolf. And although she is killing the wolf, it is for the greater good of protecting everyone else, as opposed to the huntsman's desire to kill the wolf, which is shown to be more directly linked to his desires. However, the narcissistic scopophilia which was used by the huntsman to think like the wolf in the first part of the story shows up again in the second part of the story, only this time it is actually used by the grandmother, not the huntsman. The grandmother is shown to experience narcissistic scopophilia when confronted by the threat of the second wolf. This scopophilia, however, is more closely related to her desire to protect Little Red Riding Hood and herself than it is to become like the wolf. As mentioned before, narcissistic scopophilia causes people to see themselves in someone or something else, and the grandmother is shown to experience this when the second wolf of the story jumps on the roof in order to hunt down Little Red Riding Hood. The grandmother, being able to relate enough to the wolf to see his thoughts, as the story puts it, is a very clear example of this narcissistic scopophilia being used. However, instead of being lost in that moment, she has enough awareness of her own ego to actively use this to form a plan to kill the wolf, which comes to fruition in the plan of drowning the wolf in sausage water, knowing that the smell will attract the wolf's id enough for him to jump into a trough of water that smells like meat. After the grandmother forms this plan, it is once again up to Little Red Riding Hood's second act of sublimation to save the day. Just as Little Red Riding Hood sublimates her desire to collect flowers into the action of collecting stones that were used to kill the first wolf, she sublimates her desires of collection once again into the action of collecting the meaty fragranced water that is used to drown the second wolf. Such acts of sublimation is not only what suppresses selfish or instinctual desires, but it also allows for society to move forward through people's constant use of sublimation. So when Little Red Riding Hood kills the second wolf through sublimation, what this is really doing within the narrative of the story is showing how sublimation always triumphs over the id, not just within one person who is torn between the conscience of the superego and the desires of the id, but within society as well, as through Little Red Riding Hood's sublimation, she moves society forward by showing that characters such as the wolf who only listen to the id are unable to survive in a more civilized world, thus making the world a safer place where there will no longer be wolves that easily trick people in order to eat them and their family members. It's no coincidence that a story filled with as many lessons as Little Red Riding Hood is filled with so many ideas from psychoanalysis, as it's only through such behavioral concepts that a story like this is allowed to function and move itself forward. The different types of characters found within such a simple story is easy enough for a child to understand, yet there are so many deeper concepts found within this story that is not obvious to the average person reading a bedtime story to a small child. And although this video covers the many ways that psychoanalysis moves the story forward, there is so much more that is yet to be analyzed, such as the significance of each character's age or gender. But these concepts, among others, deserve videos of their own. My name is Charles Hamaker, and I would like to thank you for watching my video.